You probably think ancient humans started burying their dead because of love, respect, or fear of disease. But the oldest deliberate human burials ever discovered did not happen after a tearful ceremony, and they were not built to protect bodies from wild animals.
The earliest graves were created by a species that was not even Homo sapiens, buried deep inside pitch-black underground caves where no sunlight could ever reach. A simple journey into the dark that flips everything we thought we knew about human intelligence completely upside down.
If you crawl through the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, you eventually reach a passage so tight it is named the Superman Crawl. Beyond that lies a chamber where hundreds of bones from Homo naledi were discovered, a creature with a brain barely larger than an orange. For decades, scientists insisted that symbolic thought and burial rites required a massive, complex human brain. Yet here was a tiny-brained hominin dragging its dead through hundreds of feet of absolute darkness, leaving them carefully arranged in deep pits long before modern humans ever walked the earth. Imagine standing at the edge of a pitch-black cave with a flickering torch, carrying the body of someone you knew. If you drop them in the open forest, scavengers erase them in hours.
But if you carry them down into the earth, they remain unchanged, shielded from the sun and rain. That single act creates a permanent location for someone who no longer exists. It makes you wonder why a creature with a tiny brain would risk crawling through narrow rock crevices in total darkness just to place a body in a specific spot. What were they actually trying to achieve?
The traditional answer from textbooks was always hygiene. Raw flesh attracts predators like hyenas and saber-toothed cats, so burying a body seems like a basic survival strategy to keep dangerous carnivores away from the camp. Consider a small band of hunter-gatherers living on the open savanna 50,000 years ago. A member of the tribe dies during the night. If you leave the body where it fell, the scent of decay travels for miles on the wind, drawing every starving predator in the region directly to your sleeping children. Digging a shallow hole or piling heavy stones over the corpse breaks the scent trail completely. It sounds like pure common sense until you look at how nomadic tribes actually dealt with dangerous waste.
When a campsite became dirty or dangerous, nomadic groups did not spend hours digging hard earth with wooden sticks. They simply packed up their gear and walked away. Digging a grave using primitive tools demands immense physical effort and burns precious calories.
Why waste hours of exhausting labor digging a hole in frozen or rocky soil when you could simply walk 2 miles away and let nature take its course? This is where the first major twist comes in. Early humans were not burying their dead to hide the smell from animals, because in many of the oldest sites, they did not even cover the bodies with dirt. They were placing them in prominent, highly visible natural features like rock shelters and deep pits, where animals could still easily smell them. They were not hiding the dead from the world, they were marking a specific place for the living. Think about a massive landmark in the landscape, like a distinctive limestone cave or an unusually shaped rock outcrop. To a band of nomads wandering across vast distances, the landscape is a confusing maze of trees and hills. Placing a family member inside a specific landmark transforms that wild location into a memorable territory marker. When you put a body in a cave, that cave stops being just a random piece of rock. It becomes the place where your father or child rests, giving your band a deep, emotional reason to return to that exact spot year after year. Researchers studying Neanderthal sites in Europe found that burials almost always occurred in places where the group regularly lived and cooked. They were sleeping, eating, and making tools directly on top of the soil that covered their fallen companions.
Living alongside the dead seems strange to us today, but for early humans, it created a powerful sense of ownership over a piece of land. If your ancestors are physically resting beneath the floor of a cave, that cave belongs to your tribe, and any outside group that tries to claim it is trespassing on your family ground.
Does that mean the very concept of property rights and territory was born not from farming or borders, but from the simple act of digging a hole for a family member? For a long time, historians believed that humans only started caring about territory when they settled down to farm 10,000 years ago.
But grave sites dating back over 100,000 years show that long before anyone planted a seed, humans were using their ancestors to lay claim to the earth. Imagine walking into a valley and seeing a cluster of raised earth mounds or stone cairns. Without a single word spoken, those mounds tell you that an organized group lives here, remembers their past, and will fight to defend the land where their predecessors rest. Yet, as archaeologists dug deeper into these ancient graves, they found something even stranger than simple territory markers. They found objects buried alongside the skeletons that made no practical sense at all. In Khafre Cave in Israel, scientists uncovered the 90,000-year-old skeleton of a young boy, resting with the antlers of a red deer delicately placed across his chest. His hands were folded, and red ochre pigment was smeared over his bones. If burial was just about marking land or keeping predators away, why go through the painstaking trouble of hunting a deer, removing its antlers, and carefully arranging them on a child's chest before covering him with earth? Antlers are weapons, tools, and symbols of strength that take effort to harvest and prepare.
Throwing away a valuable resource like a massive set of antlers by burying it in the dirt is an economic loss for a struggling survival group. This brings us to the second major twist in our understanding. Early humans were not just burying bodies, they were burying valuable wealth, food, and tools that the living desperately needed to survive. They were willingly impoverishing themselves to send objects into the ground with the deceased. Picture a harsh Ice Age winter where every scrap of leather, every sharp flint blade, and every piece of meat means the difference between life and death. Yet inside a grave at Sungir in Russia, 2 young children were buried wearing clothes adorned with over 10,000 ivory beads, each carved by hand over hundreds of hours. Carving those ivory beads required thousands of hours of intense labor, time that could have been spent hunting mammoth or stitching warm clothes for the living. Throwing those beads into a dark hole meant the community willingly sacrificed months of work for someone who could no longer help the tribe. Why would a group living on the absolute brink of starvation choose to bury their most valuable possessions underground? To answer that, you have to look at how the human mind handles the sudden disappearance of a person. When someone dies, their voice, their personality, and their presence remain crystal clear inside the memory of everyone who knew them. If a person is still completely alive inside your mind, it feels unnatural to accept that they have simply ceased to exist. Your brain naturally predicts that they will wake up, get hungry, or need their tools, because every past experience tells you that human beings keep moving. Giving a dead person their tools, weapons, and ornaments was a way of satisfying that mental glitch. It allowed the living to process the terrifying transition between a person who acts and a person who is gone. If you enjoy exploring the weird, hidden side of human history like this, hit the subscribe button right now, because we dig into fascinating mysteries just like this all the time. By placing tools in the grave, the living were treating death not as an absolute end, but as a journey to another location where those tools would still be needed. That simple mental leap laid the foundation for every religion, myth, and afterlife concept that would ever exist in human history. When you look at ancient graves around the world, you notice a striking pattern in how the bodies were positioned. They were almost never laid out flat on their backs like we see in modern funerals. In almost every ancient culture, from Europe to Asia to the Americas, bodies were pulled into a tight fetal position, with the knees drawn up to the chest and the arms wrapped tightly around the legs. For generations, scientists assumed this was done simply to make the grave smaller, reducing the amount of hard digging required by the surviving group members. A smaller body requires a smaller hole, which saves time and energy when you are digging through solid clay or frozen gravel, with nothing more than a sharpened stick or an animal shoulder blade. It seems like a straightforward physical explanation, until you try to flex a human body several hours after death has occurred. Rigor mortis sets in, making the muscles stiff and unyielding, which means curling a body into a ball actually takes significant effort and force. If the goal was minimal effort, laying a body flat or dropping it in as it fell would require far less physical struggle than forcibly binding it into a tightly curled ball. This leads to the third major twist in the story of human burial. Bodies were not curled up to save digging effort. They were deliberately bound with ropes and cords to prevent them from moving.
Ancient peoples in several regions wrapped corpses tightly in animal skins and bound them with thick leather thongs before the body cooled. In some extraordinary cases, they even placed massive, heavy boulders directly on top of the chest and skull. Imagine living in a world without science, where you do not understand why a heart stops beating or why a body decays. You have seen people fall into deep sleeps and wake up, and you have seen people collapse and suddenly sit back up. To an early human, a dead body was an unpredictable and terrifying object that might decide to stand up again in the middle of the night.
Binding the limbs and weighing the chest down with stones was a practical precaution to ensure the dead stayed where they were put. They loved their fallen companions, but they also deeply feared what that companion might become once the breath of life left their mouth.
The boundary between the living world and the dead world was razor thin, and a grave was not just a resting place, it was a barrier designed to keep those two worlds safely separated. If a body was not properly secured and buried with the right rituals, its spirit or physical frame might wander back into the camp to demand what it was owed, or to take someone else along with it. This fear of the restless dead was so intense that it shaped the very architecture of early human settlements. In some of the world's oldest permanent towns, like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, people built their brick homes directly on top of the graves of their parents and grandparents. There were no streets in this ancient town. People walked around on the roofs of houses and climbed down wooden ladders to enter their living spaces. Right beneath the raised plaster platforms where families slept and ate, the bones of their ancestors were buried in the soil. Every time a family sat down to eat a meal or sleep through the night, they were physically resting inches above the decaying remains of their predecessors. Why would anyone choose to sleep directly on top of a grave every single night for their entire lives? Living directly over your ancestors meant you were never truly alone, and their strength was constantly protecting your home from evil forces or rival groups. If an enemy tried to invade your home, they were not just fighting you, they were invading a space guarded by generations of your family, buried beneath the floorboards. It transformed the house into an impenetrable spiritual fortress where the living and the dead shared the exact same living room. Yet this intimate connection with the dead created a massive health problem that early humans had no way of understanding with science. Decaying human bodies release bacteria, toxins, and unpleasant gases that can easily contaminate living spaces and water supplies if left unchecked. Without any knowledge of germs or microscopic pathogens, early humans began noticing a terrifying trend. Communities that kept their dead too close or handled them improperly were routinely struck down by sudden and visible sicknesses. They did not know what bacteria was, but they could see the clear connection between touching a corpse and getting violently ill a few days later. This brings us to the fourth major twist. The elaborate religious rules surrounding burial, purity, and washing the dead were not created for spiritual reasons. They were the world's first public health measures disguised as sacred laws. Ancient cultures that developed strict religious taboos against touching dead bodies without washing, or rules mandating that burials happen within 24 hours, survived much longer than cultures that ignored those habits. When a rule is framed as a command from the gods or a spiritual necessity, people follow it with absolute obedience, even if they do not understand the underlying biology. Phrases like spiritual uncleanliness were simply the ancient human way of describing viral and bacterial contamination. By making the burial process a rigid, sacred ceremony overseen by leaders, society ensured that dangerous corpses were handled safely and isolated from the main supply of food and water. Consider the ritual of burning wood, resins, and sweet-smelling plants over a gravesite during an ancient funeral. To the mourners, the thick smoke was carrying the soul of the departed up into the sky, while pleasing the ancestral spirits with rich scents. To the physical environment, that same smoke was acting as a powerful disinfectant, burning away airborne pathogens and masking the scent of decay that would otherwise attract scavengers. Religion and survival were completely fused together in the soil of the grave, creating habits that kept the species alive through brutal epidemics. As human societies grew larger and constructed massive cities,
The simple dirt hole evolved into gigantic monuments like the Egyptian pyramids and elaborate underground catacombs. In places like ancient Rome, miles of underground tunnels were carved into soft volcanic rock to hold hundreds of thousands of bodies in stacked wall niches.
The rich built grand marble tombs along the main roads outside the city walls, while the poor were placed in massive collective pits called puticuli. Your brave location became the ultimate status symbol, broadcast to every traveler who walked into the city.
If you were wealthy, your name, image, and achievements were carved into stone along the busiest highway, ensuring that thousands of strangers read your name every single day for centuries. Burial had shifted from a survival mechanism into the ultimate tool for achieving personal immortality. If people keep saying your name out loud as they read your tombstone, are you ever truly dead?
This obsession with being remembered created a fascinating psychological shift in how humans viewed their own short time on Earth. People began spending their entire adult lives earning money specifically to fund their own tombs, hiring stonecutters and writing their own epitaphs decades before they expected to die.
The grave was no longer just a place where life ended. It was the central project that gave meaning to a person's entire lifetime. Think about the sheer amount of human energy, labor, and wealth that has been poured into the ground over the last 50,000 years.
Trillions of dollars worth of gold, jewels, fine clothes, and art have been sealed away in dark stone chambers, completely removed from the human economy forever. If all that wealth had stayed in circulation instead of being buried, human history might have taken a completely different economic path. Yet we continued to do it, century after century, across every continent and culture without exception. Which brings us to the fifth and final major twist in the story of human burial. We did not start burying our dead because we were smart enough to understand death. We became smart because we started burying our dead.
The act of caring for a lifeless body forced the human brain to develop abstract thinking, memory projection, and complex communication long before those skills were needed for anything else. To bury a body, you have to think about the future, a time when you will not be there, but the hole you dug will still remain.
You have to imagine what happens after tomorrow, which requires a level of mental time travel that no other animal on Earth possesses. A lion sees a dead pride member and walks away once it realizes the body does not move, completely forgetting about it within hours. A chimpanzee may sit with a dead infant for a few days, exhibiting clear signs of grief, but eventually abandons the body when it begins to decompose. Only humans stop their daily search for food, gather tools, select a specific location, and spend hours altering the physical surface of the planet to hold a body. That single mental leap required our ancestors to create symbols, tell stories, and believe in things that could not be seen, touched, or eaten. Language itself likely received a massive evolutionary push from the need to explain where people go when their physical presence disappears from the camp. When a child asks where their grandmother went after her body is placed under the earth, you cannot answer with a simple physical gesture. You have to invent complex words for spirit, memory, time, and distant worlds that exist beyond the physical horizon. Every story, every piece of art, and every scientific theory we have ever created can be traced back to that initial need to explain the silence of a grave. We built civilizations, invented writing, and constructed towering cities, all to answer the exact same question our tiny-brained ancestors faced in the dark caves of South Africa. When you look down at a simple patch of earth in a cemetery today, you are looking at the exact spot where the human imagination was born. It is a mirror reflecting our deepest fears, our greatest sacrifices, and our refusal to let the people we love simply disappear into nothingness. Think about how you personally want to be remembered when you are gone, or how your own family handles the memory of those who came before you. Do you think we bury our dead more for the peace of the person who passed, or to satisfy a deep need inside the minds of those left behind?